In the last decades, mainstream horror has usually relied on delivering its terror in a physical, adrenaline-boosting way, with jump scares. Now, I know what you're thinking, but don't worry, there is nothing to fear. We would never insert a jump scare here. Moving on, in 2018, a horror film came out. It was directed by Aster and featured Toni Collette, Alex Wolff, Millie Shapiro, and Gabriel Byrne. It was called Hereditary. Soon many critics began to praise its disturbing nature. Audiences were delightfully horrified, not because of any jump scares, mostly, but because of its themes and how they are presented. So, we watched it. I mean, it's just a movie, how bad can it be? Oh god. Okay. Fine, yes, this is fine. Everything is fine. I am forever traumatized. I'm fine. The reception of the film makes it clear. People found this movie scary, but why? What is beneath all the superficial creepy imagery so that it manages to leave a lasting impression? In this essay, we are going to explore the devices that Hereditary uses to both convey and conceal its themes.
Hereditary called our attention as a film to be analyzed due to its dual narrative. A first viewing can make us believe that the film is just another horror story dealing with cults and demons that trap the main characters. However, when looking at what other people had to say about their viewing experience, we found that the film could be subjected to an interpretation where most of what's happening isn't even real, or that it hints at a metaphorical ending beyond what we see on screen. Rewatching the film through this lens, we found that Ari Aster plays with the several filmic tools to tell two stories at the same time. We will now explain these tools in order to make our analysis.
Firstly, the films played with audiovisual cues from the horror genre are crucial for this discussion. Hereditary belongs to the current wave of horror film which oppose mainstream horror, that revolves around this scare by focusing on psychological experiences and exploring themes related to the human condition, the so-called elevated horror. Mother by Darren Aronofsky, Get Out by Jordan Peele, and Midsommar, also by Ari Aster, are just a few examples of this kind of films in recent years. The term elevated horror was coined by critics in order to justify positive reception of a horror film, and genre typically classified as low art. However, Hereditary still inherits, some generic conventions from common horror. These generic conventions include film techniques, such as low key lighting, and typical narrative tropes, such as the antagonist being a supernatural entity.
Another element that makes this film peculiar is its interplay between foreshadowing and generic story structure. Foreshadowing consists of placing clues and ideas throughout the story that hint at the outcome further ahead. It can be implemented in a film through practically any technique: dialogue, mise-en-scène, camera work, sound design, editing, or music.
Thirdly, Hereditary also calls our attention because of its use of the unreliable narrator. This is when the spectator is given a version of events by a character which does not match up with the diegetic reality of the text. It is also very important to distinguish the narrators at work in a film to analyze unreliability. We may have a diegetic narrator in the story in the form of a character who could diegetically misreport events, but films always have an implied narrator, the implied author, whose version of events should theoretically always be the truth. The cinematic narrator, who has all the tools of film language at their disposal to reveal diegetic events faithfully. So, what if this narrator becomes unreliable? How does that condition the version of the story we are told?
Hereditary deceives the viewer by playing into their expectation of the horror genre, even though its framing device and visual cues are always present as a reminder of the unreliability of the narrator as well as of the text itself. So, based on our hypothesis, Hereditary tells two stories, one about a paranormal cult attacking a family, and another one about a broken family that destroys itself from the inside. The differences between these two versions of the events help us find the theme of the film, the inability to escape from their family legacy and the lack of control. The paranormal is used as a mask for something more socioculturally plausible.
Firstly, Hereditary uses the unreliable narrator technique to convey the family trapped in their own legacy. Unreliable narration seems to convey Annie's decaying state of mind through many visual cues, and is hinted at from the very beginning. But what kind of unreliability do we find in Hereditary? Initially, we may think that Annie is our sole unreliable narrator. She is our main point of view character for the most part, narrating the family's descent into chaos, and eventually setting her husband on fire in a strange, unrealistic way. However, there are scenes where it is diegetically impossible for Annie to be narrating. There are some scenes that are actually narrated by Peter or Charlie. Coincidentally, our narrators are always blood-related. Moreover, at the end of the film, when Annie is, too dead to narrate anything, the film keeps going and we see the characters climbing into the treehouse, being abducted into the cult. We understand that the ending is only possible by assuming that there is something bigger than just Annie. The cinematic narrator is not making clear for the viewer if our access to the film's diegetic reality is the true reality. Now, this could lead to a further explanation if we take these deaths just as representations of the whole family dynamic falling apart. The fact that the film is still going lets us know that all this time we haven't really been following Annie's perspective, but rather how the family legacy has been channeled through Annie. The final shot of the film points to the artifice of the unreliable narrator with the black background surrounding the treehouse, as if it was a conceptual house floating in the middle of nowhere, as a miniature or a dollhouse. Essentially, we are presented with a universal narrator that focalizes through different characters, placing symbols and people where they shouldn't be, like the cult symbol on this log, or Joan, a person who appears both during Annie's and Peter's narration.
Hereditary plays with audiovisual cues from the horror genre, relying on the viewer having previous expectations in order to deliver its particular brand of horror, which is based on the inevitability of the events and the powerlessness resulting from it. One of the visual horror cues we can appreciate in Hereditary is low-key lighting. This technique is usually applied to try telling the audience that the mood is somber, dark, uncanny, and by literally just taking away light from the background. We have a clear example in this sequence from the horror film The Nun by Corin Hardy, in which the background is almost black and the character's face is what is highlighted. This technique predisposes the viewer to feel that what they are going to see is a typical horror movie. In this case, we can also see that the lighting choice is combined with a very typical setting, a narrow corridor. Besides, it's very common for the conflict to be against a supernatural force like a demon, a deity, an angry spirit, or similar, a characteristic which, for example, is present in Annabelle. That's why once the possibility of the existence of a demon in a cult appears in Hereditary, even though the film presents us a few clues that should make us suspect that maybe what is happening is linked to other causes, we don't notice them. Because it is a horror movie, what is happening has to be related with a demon. It has to, right? The expectations of the viewer related to the horror genre are enhanced by the film's marketing, since it was publicized as a completely different movie. It looked like the grandmother was going to hunt the family as a supernatural entity. The viewer went to the cinema thinking they were going to watch a typical supernatural hunting, and it was even sold as the new Exorcist. The beginning of the film actually plays into this. The grandmother's funeral is in the first scene we see, and the appearance of her ghost is also placed at the beginning. Add to the detail of the grandmother's corpse being desecrated. The spectator believes that there will be a simple, supernatural explanation is further reinforced through the structure of the narrative. It follows the typical discovery plot, usually in many horror films, where a main character sees a supernatural element while everyone else dismisses them. In this trope, the character ends up being right, and thus we expect the same to happen in this movie.
Okay, so what is this film about? We could talk about how grief destroys the family or how lack of communication isolates the characters. But, underneath all that, we find a common thread: lack of control. Hereditary embodies this theme all throughout the film, while also relying on generic expectations to hide it from the spectator. It's our own conditioning as viewers what leads us to deny all the foreshadowing. There are forces at work beyond the frame in Hereditary, moving people in its twisted design like toys, said Raymond De Luca. The characters are pawns. The actions are inconsequential, and the fate has already been laid out. Many techniques and motifs throughout the film serve as foreshadowing of this inevitable outcome. For starters, the very first shot of the movie establishes a recurrent visual cue. Everything is framed within a dollhouse. This reveals our characters to be nothing else than pawns with whom the forces outside the frame play with. Coincidentally, we are in the place of these forces. We are an outside spectator, watching a predetermined plan unfold and being entertained by the unraveling of the plot. The visual cue of the dollhouse continues to appear throughout the movie, both non-diegetically and diegetically. Outside the narrative, the viewer is reminded of the dollhouse motif through camera movement. The camera frequently travels through walls or the ground, reminding us that what we are watching might or might not be a mere representation rather than a plausible story. This again reinforces the position of the viewer as an outside observer. Within the narrative, it frequently comes up in the form of Annie's work as a miniaturist. She attempts to control her family by recreating it within a dollhouse. This ties back to the theme of family legacy. Annie's mother is a higher presence that metaphorically also acts as a miniaturist. From the very beginning, she has set the pieces to move according to her plan, strip them of agency. In this scene, for example, Annie sees her mother's ghost. When she turns on the light, she is no longer there, but the place where she stood reveals her influence, even beyond the grave. Right behind her, we see the blueprints for the house. This controlling nature is inherited by Annie, but ultimately, her mother wins. In an outcry to avoid becoming her, she does exactly that, and thus becomes a tormentor to her own family as well. The narrative offers many other clues that foreshadow the true nature of what we are seeing. For instance, in this scene, Peter's English class is discussing the play of Heracles.
Because he literally refuses to look at all the signs that are being literally handed to him the entire play.
I mean, notice how the focus goes from the girl to Peter when she says her line. This is what we like to call in your face.
Refuses to look at all the signs that are being literally handed to him the entire play.
The film denies the spectator the viewing of key moments, like Charlie's death or Annie finding her body. At first, this puzzled us. However, these events are not interesting to the outside forces that design the great plan. They are already predetermined. They serve merely as a trigger to what is about to happen, and thus, the reactions of Peter are the only thing worth watching. So, as we have seen, the film lays its main theme in plain sight. However, a first-time viewer does not realize this.
What is she, summoning the devil?
Several generic and medium expectations work against the audience. When we see a film, we assume that the main characters are going to be active subjects that drive the narrative forward through their actions. We assume they have agency. We feel that this family's struggle against the outside forces may lead somewhere. We care, and the eventual unfolding of their fate makes us feel anxious and powerless. This is a great source of horror in the film, since it maintains tension, which wouldn't be there if we simply accepted their lack of agency as the film proposes. For example, let's look at the ending again. When Peter goes up the treehouse and fulfills his role, the illusion of agency falls off. This sequence is no doubt disturbing, and yet it doesn't convey the same tension as what has preceded it. Peter is carrying out his fate, and there is nothing else left to do. There is no longer a struggle. A second viewing of this film is interesting because retrospection places us in the cult's perspective. It is consequently less anxiety-inducing, but once our previous expectations no longer condition us, we are able to see the clues that were there all along.
have explored the tools that Hereditary uses to deceive us and convey its themes. Now, let's analyze this sequence as a case study. Earlier in the day, Annie and her friend Joanne have held a successful seance. In this scene, Annie wakes her family at night and asks them to help her summon their dead daughter, Charlie. Peter and Steve are reluctant, but ultimately agree due to Annie's insistence. This sequence partly relies on suspense. We know that Annie has been through a seance before, so we know she's not making it up. Peter and Steve, on the other hand, have not experienced it, and so they don't believe her. However, the unreliable narrator, which is already been revealed as such, questions this suspense, since we don't know whether the previous information that we have is real or not. Right before this scene, we see this. Annie presents a reality that we believe to be true, but then this illusion is shattered. We are now unsure of whether we can trust what Annie sees. This will condition our viewing of the whole sequence in two ways. We want Peter and Steve to believe Annie, because we have seen that she's right, but at the same time we stand with them, wondering if she's losing her mind. This scene also ties back to the discovery plot we discussed earlier. In horror film, when a main character claims there is a supernatural element, they usually turn out to be right, and the others are proven wrong for not believing them. We are so familiar with this structure that we expect Annie to be correct. Let's actually start already. This first shot is very interesting. We see a dollhouse we hadn't seen before. Many versions of the house are stacked, as we ascend to see the version we know. We literally ascend through the family legacy, which is buried underneath, defining the foundations. Through this sequence, horror audiovisual cues are everywhere. Narrow hallways, low-key lighting, slow camera movement, the absence of music, and later, attention increasing low bass. This element predisposes us to read the events and supernatural related, while the dollhouse imaginary continues to be everywhere, pointing to a different reading of the scenes. The first part is made up of sequence shots. They serve to create tension, and also contrast with the second part of the sequence. We can see how fragmented the family is by their position within the frame. At the beginning, Peter and Steve share the same space, while Annie is separated. But then each member is isolated. Annie is in the foreground, Steve in the background, and Peter is out of frame. The isolation of each member is going to be expressed visually all through the scene. This shot serves almost as a POV shot, since we are nearly positioned where Annie would be standing. However, we will see her back, obscure and unfocused. This brings us back to the unreliability of the narrator. We aren't completely immersed in her perspective. We cannot see her face, and we feel that she might be hiding something from us.
We first see the characters apart, each one in a different part of the frame. But when Annie fails to convince them, she forces them to be together. This medium-long shot reinforces the idea that, although they are finally together in frame, this is not a tender moment of family reunion, but rather a cold and unnatural scenario. As the family begins to fight, the camera gets closer. They again leave one member of the family out of the frame. First Peter,
And I shouldn't have. Please, I know how it sounds, but there's no way to talk about it. I just need to show you, okay? Please, you'll see. I'm completely lucid.
Peter, go to bed.
What? No, Peter.
and then
please.
Steve,
We need to do this as a
which
family.
relates
This is
back to
all
how
about
Annie is trying to force this union, only for it to fail.
I'll stay.
Steve, please, I really need you to be open to this. Please, I promise. Both of you. Please, I need you to be open. Please. Come on, Steve, come on.
We then have this low-angle shot, which highlights the importance of the props on the table. On the one hand, what is bringing them together is failure to process their grief over Charlie's death, represented by these props. On the other hand, they also act as generic horror cues. The candle, the glass to contact the spirits, which again brings to our mind the potentially supernatural element.
Charlie, are you here?
We now have a close-up of their faces, which again separates them, showing that even if they were together, each one interprets what is happening differently.
And Daddy and Peter.
Then Peter looks behind him, which again separates him from the rest. The constant contraposition of together alone illustrates the principle of the scene. This shot also ties back to the unreliability from the narrators, since only Peter hears the sound. Again, the props are what brings them all together. Coping with Charlie's death is what they have in common.
What the hell? What?
This shot is very revealing. Annie and Peter almost become one single mass. They are the ones that feel the supernatural around them. Coincidentally, they're the ones that are blood-related. They share this inheritance, while the father is left out. These two reaction shots signal how the characters are involved in a situation which they previously did not believe in, a story beat from the Discovery plot. Again, the camera pans slowly instead of cutting. This is going to create contrast with the second part of the scene, as we will see in a moment.
That's enough.
What? No! Listen, when I did this earlier, this manifested on the page. I saw it!
What is it?
It's Charlie! Did you finish Charlie? Did you want to draw some more? You can keep going until that.
The camera starts getting closer as the tension increases.
No, I am not! Peter, listen! Stop it! Listen to me. There is no need to be scared. This is your sister.
Finally, they all see something supernatural. This gives the impression of objectivity and alleviates our doubts about the unreliable narrator. Also, the fast pan that connects the breaking glass and the characters is used to create the feeling of threat. After this event, we again see the family together in frame. Something in Annie's acting changes, although the other characters don't notice. Then we cut to the shot of Steve always looking for a rational explanation. Here, the movie plays with suspense and mystery in order to both increase tension and enhance the supernatural feeling. We know that something is wrong with Annie, but we are denied her perspective, so we are clueless. Again, this moment is presented as it would be in a typical horror movie, so we expect a jump scare. Finally, we get to this second part of the sequence. The visual language changes completely, from wider shots and long takes to closer shots and fast cuts. Having so many close-ups again isolates the family members. This event is traumatizing all of them, and what previously joined them, if forcefully, is now broken. Again goes Steve to solve things rationally. On you go, sweetie, you keep trying. When Annie speaks, we hear two voices superimposed, again reinforcing the supernatural element. And suddenly, the lights turn on. The unreliability and ambiguity of the situation fade away. The lights recontextualize the whole setting. It goes from non-verosimil to verosimil, as if we had woken up from a nightmare. Like in the beginning, Peter and Steve are separated from Annie, joined by their perception that she has lost her mind. And lastly, we finish this sequence with yet another shot of the dollhouse, as a reminder of this inescapability. As we have seen, this sequence uses all the tools we have previously discussed to encode the hidden meaning of the film, while also using visual language to reflect on the relationships between the characters, highlighting their isolation from one another. Hereditary doesn't reinvent horror. In fact, the plot it presents is quite standard. However, the emotional core of the film lies underneath. The themes of inescapability from one's family legacy and of lack of control are hidden by means of an unreliable narrator, presenting them in an ambiguous manner, and also by playing with audience expectations in order to lead us to a more conventional conclusion. This deeper nature becomes a thread for the viewer to find and uncover. So, to sum up, never take a film for granted. It may go beyond what meets the eye.